also like to thank those of you who are listening in via Zoom for spending a few time with us to reflect on what genetics, what genomic data are doing for rewriting the history of this period, the so-called migration period. Now, quite understandably, until now, most of historical interest in the uses of ancient DNA has been focused on mobility, migration, and identity, often ethnic identity. This research has caught the interest and imagination of wider audiences than merely the scientific community because of the increasing interest in personal and national identity and origins. Here in Hungary, this search, in particular for the origins and identity of the Magyars, has a very long history. We all know that already in 1235, Friar Julian, aware of the differences between Hungarian language and customs and those of their Slavic, Germanic, and Romance neighbors, traveled to Magna Hungarica, probably modern Bashkiria, we're not really sure, to discover the ancestral homeland and reconnect with distant relatives of the Magyar. Today, this search takes on new and ideologically inflected resonance. Were the conquering Hungarians part of a larger Finno-Ugric population, or descendants of populations closely related to modern Central Asia? Were the conquering Magyars newcomers to the area, or were they actually local descendants of the Huns and the Avars, or a second wave of the same population? Such questions are at once understandable and problematic. Recent publications that have attempted to settle these questions have been contradictory and at times tendentious. According to a recent study, let's see if I can, how are we going to, should I just use this? Okay. All right. So according to a recent study headed by Elizabeth Foti, the conquering Magyars were a mixture of Hunnic Turkic peoples, Finno-Ugric peoples, Caucasian populations, and Slavs from the Eastern European steppes. Well, perhaps, but then Tibor Török and his colleagues claim that the Huns, the Avars, and the Magyars shared a common origin. What happened to the Slavs, the Caucasian population, and so forth. Miklos Kassler claim, based on the sequencing of the Y chromosome of King Bela III, that the members of the Arpad house are definitely Eurasian, not Finno-Ugritic. Perhaps. And finally, Viktor Orban stated at the 6th summit of the Cooperation Council of Turkic-speaking states in 2018 that, quote, Hungarians see themselves as the late descendants of Attila the Hun. They stand on the basis of Turkic Hunnic origins. If any of these studies, and to the extent that these studies are pronouncements or simply a search for Hungarian origins, this wouldn't be a problem. The real problem is what the great French historian Marc Bloch referred to as the idol of origins. Too often, he wrote, the search for origins is not really about beginnings, but rather about causal explanations, and moreover, about causes that explain everything. There, he wrote, is the ambiguity. There is the danger. Unless we are careful, the search for origins becomes a search for some eternal essence that is assumed to illuminate not only the past, but to define the present and to provide a guide for the future. Heeding the warning of Marc Bloch, we would do well then to focus on studies of migration and mobility on origins, not causes, and certainly not on essences. Nor should we attempt to equate the identities of long distant populations in the past with contemporary peoples. And indeed, recent studies employing archaeological, isotopic, and genomic data have advanced our understanding of origins and migratory movements, long the subject of scholarly controversy. In the past decade, geneticists have made major advances in such areas as illuminating the tripartite origin of modern Europeans, the manner in which agriculture spread from the Near East and Anatolia into Europe, the origins of otherwise obscure groups in ancient history, such as the so-called Sea Peoples or Philistines recorded in the Bible. Genetics has also illuminated important topics in early medieval history, such as the movement of continental populations into Britain in the 5th and 6th centuries. And finally, also the movement of Italic, Germanic, Hunnic, Avar, Slavic populations into the Carpathian Basin. To review some of these studies and their results, did the agricultural revolution take place through a process of knowledge transfer or through population movement? We know that not only technology, but actual populations moved from the Near East and Anatolia and did indeed spread across the Mediterranean, Western Europe. What this meant for the indigenous inhabitants, whether this took place peacefully or through terrible violence, we cannot yet say. Were the raiders known in some ancient texts as sea peoples who established polities along the Eastern Mediterranean indigenous groups, or Western seafarers from a collapsing Mycenaean civilization? Recent genomic studies strongly suggest that for a brief period, this new culture that appeared in what is now Lebanon and Israel was driven by the latter. For decades, British scholars have debated whether the transformation of Roman Britain into Saxon England was the result of an elite takeover and assimilation of the indigenous population into a new, more continental form of society, simply the transmission of ideas and cultural practices, or if it was affected by massive migration of men and women from the continent onto the island. Increasingly, the genetic data indicate a genuine, massive arrival of a new population, even if in many cases, the existing population was not exterminated, but rather absorbed by the newcomers. Who were the Avars who took over the Carpathian Basin at the end of the 6th century and created a new kingdom that dominated the region until the early 9th century? Were they, as Turks told the Byzantines, rebels from their own kingdom who had stolen the name of Avar because of the terror it instilled in their neighbors? Or actually a fraction of the survivors of a much further eastern kingdom, perhaps Aruran, from Eastern Asia, who would move rapidly across the steppe into Europe? Today, thanks to genomics, we can confirm that the latter is the stronger hypothesis. The obscure origin of the Slavs has long been debated between those who imagine an ethnogenesis, that is, the transformation of indigenous populations already living along the Danubian frontier, who adopted new, radically decentralized forms of social and political organization, in the course of the 6th and 7th centuries, and those who posit not only a cultural transformation, but a considerable influx of population from the north and east. Increasingly, longitudinal studies of genetic patterns in the Balkans and elsewhere, some of which are being presented at this conference, are finding a considerable change not only in material culture and social organization, but in the genetic background of those groups who will in time be known as Slavs. These discoveries of origins, however, remain part of the distant past. They are not descriptions of the present or blueprints for the future. They are indeed important investigations into beginnings, not into identities. So our genetic research has confirmed numerous population movements, some leading to assimilation of new arrivals and natives, others to subordination of locals by migrants, and others indeed perhaps to expulsion or extermination and replacement. Until recently, the applications of genomics has tended to stop once the putative origins of these populations has been discovered. Now we know X came from Y place to Z place. However, when genomics combined with archaeological, isotopic, and historical data can do much more than simply uncover patterns of movement or attempt to determine identities of migrating populations. We can use these same techniques to understand what happened in individual communities and regions once these diverse groups settled in among the indigenous population. We are able now to get a deeper understanding of the organization, diversity, even something the cultural practices of these new populations and polities. An understanding impossible if we restrict ourselves to the archaeological and historical records. I'd like to discuss some of these significant issues that HistoGenes is addressing, issues that go beyond the question of migration, as valid and important as it is, and look at communities as they form, particularly in this region of Central Europe, and how they develop through time. The three specific topics that I would like to discuss this evening then are to move away from identity in the sense of ethnic or national identity toward different, more specific identities, such as gender roles, social structures, status, marriage patterns, and the like. Population changes, coalescence or continued separation within communities, role of biological kinship and marriage strategies and the construction of these societies. These, of course, are questions that are also about identity, but identity within local communities, not simply about populations in movement. So let's start with local population changes. What changes in population can we see as a result of the macro level political changes at the end of late antiquity? To what extent do the indigenous populations and the new arrivals, regardless of their ethnic identity, combine to form a new community or, contrarily, remain separate groups within the same location? What is the role of biological kinship and marriage strategies and the construction and maintenance of these structures? Genomic data combined with analysis of stable isotopic data and archaeological evidence can provide us with significant ways to better understand all three of these questions. So what changes in local population do we see as a result of these changes of late antiquity? Given the reality of significant population movements, what effects do they have on these communities? Two commonly employed methods of evaluating the complex genetic makeup of individuals involve comparing each individual's complex genetic makeup to reference populations. In one, called principal component analysis, a statistical procedure that identifies patterns in a complex data set. It does this by converting the set of possibly correlated variables into a set of those components that account for as much of the variance as possible within the set. Thus, the first component accounts for the greatest variance, the second for the second, so forth. Now, principal component analysis is well known to mathematicians and others and can be used to follow any number of components. But in genetics, it's frequently used to create a visual representation of genetic distance and relationships separating individuals or populations on an XY axis. Specifically, they plot the principal components separating their samples against the modern data set. It's unfortunate that the slide does not fully capture what should be on here, but a simple map of modern European populations created not with any reference to geography, but simply by allowing individuals to reorganize, organized according to an XY axis, the first and second principal components, actually creates visually a map of Europe. The geography is not supplied, but the individuals become visible in relationship to each other, and a map of Europe emerges from simply the application of these two principal components taken from a large data set. The result does not indicate that the individuals should be identified with the modern populations with which they coincide, but it does suggest the general geographical regions from which they came. Each of the dots in this image represents one individual from within a European population. By simply allowing them to separate themselves based on their proximity or distance to every other dot, every other person, what we get is a recognizable map of Eurasia. And this will be very important in our use in ancient DNA. We'll see a number of these in what I have to say. The audience in this room is more than familiar with this. The wider audience, perhaps less so. Now, at the macro level, a number of studies have shown the genetic diversity of I did something. Okay, yeah. Right, okay. As shown, the genetic diversity that existed within Western Europe at the height of the Roman Empire, and a longitudinal study of Western Europeans would indicate the changes in European population across time. But the second model that we use frequently, besides principal component analysis, is something called admixture analysis, in which we use model-based ancestry clusterings to get a general understanding of genetic population. Again, we use a modern reference population, in this case, the 1000 Genomes Project, with stand-in populations, CEU plus GBR means essentially Northwest Utahns, actually. It should be Europeans, but they're using Americans with a Northwest European genealogy. Finns, Italians, Iberians, East Asians, and so forth. There are other data sets to Africa and South Asia. But this is, for example, just a model of a little village near Turin in Italy from around 600. So we see that we have people who are primarily Italian. They have a bit of something that looks like Iberian. They also have something that is northern and bits of other things. These are not indicating that these people are from Tuscany, Finland, the Iberian Peninsula, Northern Europe. These are simply ways of understanding different percentages of a population, which we can then follow over time. It can be very confusing and distorting to think that this means that these people are from the areas that the modern data sets generate. And of course, these data sets themselves are composites. There is no such thing as a pure Tuscan or a pure Northern European or a pure Iberian. These are themselves very complicated mixtures which are consolidated for ease of analysis. So if we take a look at the Roman world in late antiquity, we find that, for example, a longitudinal study shows that the imperial Rome, that's the city of Rome, had an extremely diverse population. Here we see a PCA analysis of the city of Rome in the imperial period, with a very strong Eastern Mediterranean bias, components that overlap with modern populations of Greece, Malta, Cyprus, and Syria, which shows how very cosmopolitan and international Rome was, with also African and Western, Southern European as well. In late antiquity, this balance shifts toward a much more Northern European orientation, suggesting both that the flow of population to the capital from the Eastern Mediterranean ceased, and a considerable population influx from north and west. Even outside the capital, at a regional level, we can see similar shifts in areas such as the province of Illyria, modern Slovenia and Croatia, where we see the same broad spectrum of populations during the imperial period and a considering narrowing in the early Middle Ages, and a shift from Mediterranean to a northern population. This is the region of Ljubljana, where we, in the 3rd, 5th century, a lot of red, a little blue. 5th, 6th century, we see more blue, less red, less variation. Bits that represented African ancestry pretty much disappeared. And then when we get to the 9th, 11th century, we see a considerable transformation from this population that had existed in the region 3rd to 5th century into the High Middle Ages, when we see a much more northern eastern cline, which suggests major population changes in this area. If we look at micro level, again, looking at this on our PCA plot, if we look the 4th and 5th century, on the left is Eurasia and the right is Europe. We see this very broad spread. 5th to 6th, narrowing down, and then 7th to 8th, narrow, and then moving forward into this more Eastern world. Now, these groups are quite themselves varied in genetic ancestry, but showing definite tendencies within this world. And if we look at micro-regions away from the great centers of Roman power, the image is much more variable. What happens in Rome is not necessarily what happens in the hinterlands. In the region of Turin, for example, in northwestern Italy, in the Piedmont, up to around 600, there's relatively little evidence of a northern influence. Then around 600, we see a significant change with a major appearance of this blue within a population that remains predominantly red, but now from a very small amount, there's a considerable change. So something is happening in this area. Likewise, along the Danubian frontier here in what would become Hungary, population already in the 4th and 5th centuries showed people with considerable heterogeneous origins already living side by side. If we look at the region of the Little Hungarian Plain in the 4th and 5th centuries, we will see a population with a heavy Southern European component, as well as a scattering from the Eastern Mediterranean and Africa, rather like that image of Rome that we had seen previously. This diversity declines in the 5th and 6th century, becoming more predominantly along a north-south axis. Then in the 7th and 8th centuries, we see the presence of both more eastern and northeastern populations arriving in the area, although the mass population remains northwestern and southern European. These are not population replacements. These are subtle but significant changes in the mix. And the progress is clear both in principal component analyses and in these admixture graphs that we have looked at. So in conclusion, we see definite changes in the composition of communities across the Western Europe, although the composition remains predominantly what it had been before, combination of individuals with a mixture of northern and southern ancestry who across the centuries absorbed newcomers from Asia and from northeastern Europe. Our second question is to ask, to what extent these new arrivals remain a separate community within the larger settlements or merging with them? Do they maintain cultural practices that suggest an identity that is distinct from their neighbors who have a different ancestry? Such a question cannot be answered by genetics alone, but requires close collaboration with archaeologists. And one of the most important aspects of HistoGenes is that this is not a genetic project any more than it's an archaeological project or an isotopic or an anthropological or an historical project, but requires cooperation as equals among all of these disciplines. And certainly in this region, I should emphasize the fundamental role of Hungarian archaeologists, as well as geneticists and anthropologists in the project. So in order to understand how these communities coalesce or do not, archaeologists and geneticists look for positive correlations between genetic ancestry and cultural practices in the cemeteries that we are studying. We are examining roughly 100 cemeteries, 6,000 individuals in this region from the 4th to the 9th century. So the largest data set of ancient DNA ever undertaken, but trying to do it at the micro level, not only at the regional and the transregional level. In particular, then, Hungarian archaeologists working closely with geneticists are able to show the complexities and accommodations in these mixed communities. In the Western Balaton region, for example, analysis of 4 cemeteries in close proximity, dating from the late 5th to the middle of the 6th century, show considerable variation within this ancestry. These are 4 sites with very radically different organization, different population structures, and they're all within 30 kilometers of each other over less than a century. Certain cultural practices, such as cranial deformation, artificial cranial deformation created by binding infants' heads, the presence of typical ensembles of women objects such as beads, brooches, and the like, correlate significantly with individuals who had predominantly a Northern European genetic background at a number of these sites. At Fonyard, for example, out of 11 well-preserved skulls, at least 7 show this cranial deformation. They correlate highly with individuals whose genetic background corresponds to a more intermediate Northern ancestry. Similarly, at these sites, one finds a correlation between the presence of amber beads, brooches, and double-sided combs, a so-called female ornament package. Only females at this site from ancestry A will have such things as amber and stone beads, bow brooches, double-sided combs. This female package, classic in 5th century burials in the region, but only identified with this genetic group, although they're all living together in the same village and in death form a community, presumably in life as well. Such correlation suggests that even within these small communities around the Balaton, different groups maintain certain distinct cultural traditions over several generations. However, the continuation of such practices seems to have been selective. While some traditions continue through generations, others merge. They're often such that merge forms of graves, which tend to be the same regardless of ancestry. The practice of burying weapons in male graves or not, that does not correlate with ancestry. In these evolving small communities, selective adaptation suggests that newly arrived groups and long-established populations begin to share certain aspects of commonality while absorbing others or changing together. The final topic that I would address is the role of biological kinship and marriage strategies in the construction and maintenance of social structures. Here, our comprehensive analysis of entire cemeteries has made it possible to construct biological pedigrees showing the relationships among those buried at these sites, because of the possibility of using even degraded and poor genetic data to establish biological kinship within second, third generations, and at times even to recognize ties beyond that. We can, as it were, open up the cemetery, look into the graves, and reestablish biological pedigrees of the people who are buried there. Now, of course, one must emphasize from the start that biological relatedness is not the same as kinship. Biological ties, biological pedigrees, and socially meaningful bonds may be quite different. They may correspond, they may not. A parent might not recognize an offspring, and attitudes of animosity as well as affection, then as now, can characterize relationships among parents, siblings, and more distant relatives. Organization of society may privilege office, function, role in society over biological ties. So simply recognizing biological pedigrees does not guarantee that this is a form of social cohesion. Thus, to evaluate the significance of biological relationships within our communities, we must also consider data such as location of burials, material cultures, patterns of networks among biological kindreds. To go back to our northern Italian sites, for example, Eötvös has been able to identify 4 sets of biological kin at this cemetery in Colegno, the largest, which extends over 5 generations. Biological relatedness generally corresponds, in fact, with the burial location, suggesting that these biological solidarities mirrored, at least to some extent, social solidarities. Comparing the evidence of material culture within the cemetery, we find that individuals such as those in Kindred 1 and Kindred 2 share very similar types of grave goods and burial practices, but they have very distinct, different genetic backgrounds. To look at this again, we have the blues and the mixed. Material culture would not separate them. Genetics suggests that they have different origins. They seem to belong to the same cultural world. Moreover, we find that although they have a similar cultural background, marriage between these two groups, one overwhelmingly blue and the other mixture, they don't intermarry until the third generation, when a woman from the first pedigree marries into the second. And then the offspring of this union are ultimately buried with members of the second. Notably, throughout the history of the cemetery, which spans over a century, neither of these groups, who seem to be members of an elite that moved into Colegno the end of the 6th century, ever intermarry with Kindred 3, who seem to be very local. Nor do they intermarry with Kindred 4, who well may be members of a different group who arrive in Colegno in the course of the 7th century. Thus, we see that there are social values, cultural values, even within a homogeneous society that will structure how marriages will take place and with whom one does not marry, that are not necessarily questions of ethnicity, but of local cultural practice. Back in Hungary, for example, at Menfosanak, we encounter very mixed pedigrees right from the beginning. Many more intermarriages among these kindreds. It's been suggested that it almost looks like everybody has to marry somebody who's different from themselves, generation after generation. A very complicated, very different pattern for what we see elsewhere. Something about this community is different from even their neighboring communities in the region. At another site, for example, in Hegyke, in the late 5th to early 6th century, we find a complex set of biological pedigrees, groups that are buried for the most part in family groups, it would appear. Male burials, there's a strong correlation between grave goods and ancestry. For example, all males are buried with weapons. But then another location near the Balaton at Hash, there appears to be no relationship between biological relatedness and location of graves. Here, other values seem to be at work. One cannot generalize about communities. So gradually, we're beginning to recognize that biological kin relations between some nearby communities, suggesting that they participated in forging solidarity through the exchange of wives in the 7th and 8th century in particular. In a number of the large sites that we study, we find that men form the focus of the local population, with women consistently coming from outside of the community. No close marriages, no consanguineous marriages within these communities. Women are brought in from where we don't yet know, but we're beginning to try to connect from one village to another, sometimes over greater distances, as people look for the patterns within these communities, the ways that they replicate themselves based on cultural and familial values. In some communities, then we find this exchange of wives with women buried with their husband's community. In others, we find some kindreds with a very specific ancestry settled among people with completely different background. And this continues for generations to find marriage partners who share their own background, although we don't yet know where they get these spouses. A particularly important study that was presented here today looks at 2 sites in Eastern Austria. One for generations maintains a strong Central Asian or identity, constantly finding wives someplace who correspond to their genetic background, and the other just a few kilometers away that's very Western, continues to be very Western, and we see very little exchange of population through marriage within these communities. What this means, we're not yet sure, but these are the kinds of questions that HistoGenes is trying to answer, quite beyond migration. How does a community cohere? How does culture, in certain cases, predominate over ancestry, over biology? In other cases, it seems that ancestral identity is an overriding value. And such analyses carried out at the village level that are making it possible to penetrate the processes by which families and extended kindreds continue to reproduce social bonds, status, custom, or begin selectively to change those, changing some, keeping others, keeping some, particularly among women, while men begin to appear in their cultural practice very much the same. In other cases, men continuing certain cultural practices, certain kinds of funerary practices. So the enormous diversity within these societies. If no clear pattern of community formation emerges from these individual studies, this probably accurately reflects the complexities of the Carpathian Basin from the 4th to the 9th centuries. From the outset, our communities are complex amalgams of people whose ancestry reaches across Europe and beyond to Asia and even to the Far East. New arrivals do not replace this complexity with a new homogeneous population, but simply add to the complexity. Our intense studies of numerous sites across the Carpathian region, across these centuries, show that each community is in many respects unique, even if their inhabitants' backgrounds appear quite similar. We see gradual changes as new groups of people arrive and settle into pre-existing communities, or form new communities which will appear in the course of the centuries that we study. Sometimes these mixed groups merge easily. At other times, they seem to go to lengths to maintain their uniqueness. In some, biological kinship dictates the ways that they are grouped in death and presumably in life. In others, different criteria, as yet unknown, determine such patterns. Only continued careful interdisciplinary research of the type being conducted by the HistoGenes teams will gradually build up a deeper understanding, not just of migration, certainly not of essences, certainly not of causes, but of how people across this region organize and structure their lives as they continued to evolve through the centuries. Thank you.